Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeff Partridge. I'm a professor of English at Capital Community College, and I'm the director of the Hartford Heritage Project. And I want to welcome our live audience who is here. We have some students from Capital Community College and lots of friends from the community here to hear this talk tonight. So I want to welcome all of you, and I want to welcome everyone who's online, streaming this or maybe seeing it recorded later. We want to thank you for attending tonight. In 2011, we at Capital Community College, we got a grant from the National Humanities Endowment for the Humanities, to start a project that is called the Hartford Heritage Project. It's a place-based education project wherein we introduce Hartford resources like the Old State House and many others to faculty and encourage them and support them in creating curriculum around it and bringing students out to these wonderful places that we have in our community. And it's a way for them to learn about their own subject in a very real, hands-on way, and to get excited about the sort of things that you can learn here in these great institutions in Hartford. When we launched that project, we invited a man named Bill Hosley, who's going to be coming up here in a moment. And we asked him, because he's got a wealth of experience. He's been doing this for 41 years, working on just getting the word out about Hartford and how fascinating the history is. We invited him to come and do our first talk. And it was amazing, the sort of things that he was telling us about Hartford. And so tonight, he's going to be doing that same kind of thing again. He's going to be showing for you everything that is valuable in Hartford and in terms of learning and the history and the rich history here. One of the things that Bill often says is that you can't love a place you don't know. And so his mission and our mission in the Hartford Heritage Project is to introduce Hartford in a way that will make you feel something good about it, because there is so much good here. I want to thank the Old State House for hosting us for this whole series. And please do tune in for all the other series and come down and meet us in person. We're going to be here the next on Thursday nights, and we have a Saturday tour as well that's going to be fabulous. But now I'd like to welcome Bill Hosley to come up and give his talk.
Hey, thank y'all for coming out. I'm really thrilled to be here again, and I really mean it. I didn't grow up here. People go, oh, well, how did you get interested in Hartford? I knew a little bit about it, and I was always interested in New England. I grew up in New York State, but it's been a blessing because we are sitting, as I often say, on a gold mine. There's so much here to animate the spirit, inspire affection, and all those good things. So we'll get right into it. This program is an update, is an up-to-date version of the presentation, as Jeff mentioned, that launched the Hartford Heritage Lecture Series in 2018, a program that uses the resources of this place as a fundamental part of the learning experience. It's timely, innovative, and necessary idea, not just because historical perspective and critical thinking matter, but because it addresses one of the fundamental challenges of our time, the challenge of civic attachment. Civic attachment. Hartford was and is a great place with an abundance of institutional excellence and a cultural heritage that few places this size can rival. To know Hartford's journey of the past 386 years is to be overwhelmed with a sense of aspiration and resourcefulness. As Maya Angelou famously intoned, our lives have indeed already been paid for by the toil, sacrifice, and effort of those who came before. Gratitude is the wellspring of civic spirit. Civic spirit nurtures socially cooperative behavior, teamwork, and entrepreneurship. By revealing the narrative power of art, architecture, and artifacts, we celebrate the value of local knowledge and access to cool and authentic stuff from the past. Close observation and awareness that places are enriched by the stories we tell transforms everyday learning and living into a pathway for engaged citizenship. Place matters. Place matters. As it is impossible to love a person you don't know, it's also hard to love a place you don't know, and not just in the present, but through these the layered past that brought us here. So let's dive right in. Gosh, what a world we live in. You know, everything, we are constantly bombarded with things that distract us away from what I would call civic affection. You and I, we are not defined by what we own or shopping or gambling or all this stuff. We are defined by the things of the heart and things, you're constantly told, this is called celebrityism. Celebrities, we all know what they are. They got a job to do too, but we don't need to be their enablers. Then, God help us, what have we just been through over the past? The pandemic has been awful. Whatever one thinks of Trump or Biden or the political moment, the monument removals, to me, it's been kind of stressful. And so what I'm trying to do here, and this is not new in a sense, strident intolerance, and also there have been certain periods of tremendous strife and conflict in our national life. So this is not entirely new. It's the price we pay for freedom. And I'm old enough to remember the 60s and even 1968 when people were throwing Molotov cocktails and all angry about the Vietnam War. I understand that, but there is a place for civility. And ultimately, of course, I mean, we the P word, as I sometimes call patriotism, maybe that's the wrong word today. Maybe it's just national pride and feeling something about the place where you live, the state where you live, and even the country where you live. So who knows, poor Liberty, she's probably cringing, but there is an antidote. And that antidote is thinking local and embracing, if I had a magic wand, all the way kids are educated about history, civics, and community would be starting local and looking at using the things that are in their immediate environment to enrich their sense of belonging. Well, the Hartford Narrative, at the time of the bicentennial, 1976, I'm also old enough to remember that, every town in Connecticut got a little bit of money to put up a sign and report the short version of who they are, where they came from, the town histories. Hartford has one of these. The Hartford Narrative, is shown in this marker, has been narrow and far less interesting and inclusive than we'd like. So, history is something we make. It's not like the tablets of Moses that you inherit. It's something we create, every generation rethinking what matters and what needs to be remembered. And the more diverse and inclusive, a more diverse and inclusive narrative certainly helps, and a lot of effort is being put into that. But at the end of the day, again, think local, learn local. Eventually, I'd love to see a Hartford magnet school with a place-conscious curriculum. This is not complicated. There's unbelievable stuff, and we're about to get right into it, that you can see and do and learn right here without ever even leaving town. My involvement with this began 40 years ago by developing the big Connecticut 350th exhibition at Wadsworth Atheneum, where I then worked. So much has changed since. One of the great things about Hartford is that we find footprints in the sand from every stage in the American story. So much has changed in the years since. We miss stuff you'd never miss today. And I'm going to start with that. For example, this was an art show. Biggest exhibition ever mounted at the Wadsworth Atheneum, he said humbly, but it was great in 1985. But we overlooked all this, and the fact that by the time the English and the Europeans arrived, the indigenous peoples had been here 10,000 years, and so much we've learned since, and there's a lot more that can be learned. The Sakyog tribe, one of the Connecticut River tribes that lived here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, were part of the Algonquin Federation. And their early 17th century maps, I mean, sure most of you know that Connecticut is an Indian name, and you look at and think about place names. in this region. And the native history is present in those place names, but it's also present in artifacts. These are some of their progress and scholarship in the range of museums dedicated to the study and preservation of Connecticut's indigenous peoples' culture has grown with the Indian Research Centers in Mystic, Washington Depot, and the Tannequidgeon Museum in Uncasville. If you ever get a chance to visit Uncasville, the picture on the middle left there shows our tour guides and some of the artifacts there. It's really great. And you learn a lot. And of course, the crown jewel of Native American museums and cultural studies, the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, which really it didn't even exist when we did our Connecticut River exhibit. So much to learn. That picture on the lower right also actually shows the beginnings of the Pequot War, which the English and the natives started. There was a lot of friction almost right off the bat. So there's a lot of history we don't always talk about, and maybe we should. Alas, narratives about our first peoples were romanticized and typically emphasized the peaceful transfer of lands, which was not always so. And these are some cool images. The one in the upper right there is actually not Hartford, it's Stamford, Connecticut, and it's in the City Hall of Stamford, and it shows one of these scenes of the English and the Indians breaking, sharing their cultures and trading land, and there's a lot to it. Knowing our place in a deep, granular, and compelling way starts with geology, geography, and Connecticut's abundant waterways. And the picture on the upper left shows the three major watersheds in eastern Connecticut, the Connecticut River in the middle, and then the Housatonic on the right. So one thing, and really water is kind of what made Connecticut rich, because at the beginning of the industrial age, water was the power source for industrialization. And then the rocks. In November, I'm doing a program, Zoom program for the the Gun Museum in Washington, Connecticut, on the history of the marble industry in Western New England. And it's a topic I love, but that's different geology in the West and the East. We've cluttered up the landscape with so many roads, strip malls, and junk that it's not always easy to really see the natural beauty of our state. But there are, of course, places where it can be seen. And my dear friend Lester Smith will enjoy this, because did your father engineer that bridge? Well, that's shown on the left here. So, and it's just, the river itself is gorgeous. First came the Dutch, paid tribute in the lower right by the 1890s office building for the Capewell Manufacturing Company in Hartford. That's a Dutch Dutch revival building. On the upper left is a conjectural illustration of the House of Hope, which was the Dutch settlement in what is now Dutch Point, near where Coltsville is. And on the upper right is the Onrus. This was a ship it's a reproduction of the boat that the Connecticut River Museum in Essex owns and operates. Then came Thomas Hooker and the English Puritans, and that has been covered extensively and romanticized. On the upper left there is this amazing map that was created in, I think, around 1900 by a researcher who did all this land research to figure out who lived where. It purports to show the plots, the land, who lived in every location that was then developed in 1640. So Hartford, became rather quickly developed, and there are many stories connected to that era. I don't know if my friends at the old State House have ever seen this. Maybe they have, but I found this about a year or two ago. The picture on the lower left shows a reproduction of Thomas Hooker's house and a reproduction of the first church in Hartford that were erected on the grounds of the old State House in 1935 for the tercentenary, the 300th anniversary of Connecticut. I'm not going to get into all the stuff about the Charter Oak, but that's a story you can Google, and it's an important part of our local story. I like to start my pursuit of place consciousness in burying grounds and cemeteries. Hartford's offer endless opportunity for learning, leisure, and discovery. If I had a magic wand, as I've said, our schools would make intensive use of our astonishing abundance of cultural resources. And these are brochures for a couple of the Hartford cemeteries. This is Hartford's ancient burying ground, which is Hartford's oldest historic site. There are artifacts there going back to the middle of the 17th century. The history, the art, the folk art, local, indigenous, free, and accessible every day. And this is just some of the, I like folk art. So these are some pictures from the ancient burying ground in Hartford, and astonishing stuff, really. And, every gravestone potentially tells a story. It's never been easier to research things online. I mean, I talk about research projects I did when I was young, where you'd go to the State Library, the Connecticut Historical Society, and spend weeks sometimes going page by page through documents. And so much of this stuff, like the Hartford Current online, is digitized and searchable. So if you have a name, anybody you want to, that made the news, I mean, and there's so many topics, it's just amazing. Well, this is an ad for Israel Seymour. He was a potter. He made pottery. And he's famous in the legend and lore of the ancient burying ground because he was blown up while standing in the doorway of his house in an electrical storm. And this scared everybody because they were pretty supernatural and they thought this was some kind of divine punishment. But it's a very amazing story that is interesting to learn about and to talk about in the ancient burying ground in Hartford. Then this is Old North Cemetery and Spring Grove Cemeteries. And some of you may, hopefully it'll be a nice day, but we're on November 13th. We're doing a tour that I'm so proud of. Jeff and I Partridge and I put this together, a tour of Spring Grove Cemetery. I haven't done one in 20 years, and this will be the best version ever. And then we're going to be at the Faith Congregational Church, the continuing parish of the oldest African-American congregation. Do I have that right? In Hartford. And their history group is going to interpret that. There's so much to it. And so these are two cemeteries in the North End. I've spent a lot of my years here interested in working in the North End of Hartford. My friend Rebecca Tabor here, we used to work together at the Connecticut Landmark Society. One of my favorite properties is the Isham Terry House, which is up in that neighborhood. And we did one of the coolest things I ever involved with was the North Hartford Festival. We worked on it together. I won't go into it, but there's so much in Old North. This is the final resting place of Connecticut Governor William Ellsworth, who, among other things, was the attorney for Prudence Crandall and was the governor at the time of the Amistad event. So he was a anti-slavery crusader, you could say. And these are, the stories that you can tell standing in front of these monuments are wonderful. Cedar Hill Cemetery is where all the lifestyles of the rich and famous. You go there, you see it. Beautiful stuff. And by the way, these cemeteries often have wonderful plantings, trees, flowers. So they're, I like to call them one-stop shopping for art, history, and nature. These are J.P. Morgan, Katharine Hepburn, Elizabeth and Sam Colt, and then the lower center there, Civil War General Griffin Stedman are all buried in Cedar Hill Cemetery in the south end of town. Jewish heritage, a handful of parish burying grounds, including Beth Israel, and then Temple Beth Israel, now the Charter Oak Cultural Center. So there is, the diversity that is Hartford is widely apparent in the artifacts. St. Patrick's Cemetery up in the North End, Irish Hartford, so much unstudied and ripe for inquiry and discovery. And again, I've spent 41 years at this. I do other things, but local history has been my thing. And I have barely scratched the surface of what's possible to know and learn. Again, these sites are a veritable learning lab, open daily and for free. And I've had fun at various times taking some of the Capital Community College students around, looking at stuff. And for a number of years, I did parents and alumni weekends at Trinity College, where we'd get on a bus and we'd go to this place, and I'd always take them to things. You know, everybody's heard of the Mark Twain House. Mark Twain House is great. But there's so much nobody's heard of, and a lot of it's free. So those are the places that I like to go. Architecture. By 1876, Hartford was famous enough that a national magazine was writing glowing accounts featuring, among other things, its remarkable buildings, some of which survive. On the lower right there is the Mark Twain House, others don't. But Hartford, sometimes said to be the richest small city in America in the Gilded Age, but neither here nor there. A lot of great things happened here, and the more you know, the easier it is to appreciate and love it. The Goodwin Building, the most cosmopolitan commercial building in New England when it was completed in 1881. The Cheney Block, 1874, just down the street here, designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, famous architect. It's still standing. Trinity College itself has an amazing campus that was designed, the only project executed in the United States by British architect William Burgess, shown on the right there. And I had a ball in 2019. I had a little consulting project working for Travelers, doing a history of their Travelers Tower building. It was 100 years old at that point, and I got inside and looked at a lot of stuff. They've got great archives, and I love that painting on the left there is at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and that shows, it's one of my favorite views. You can't really do this today because there's another big steel and glass building between the old State House and Travelers Tower, but what a breathtaking vista that was and is. Travelers Tower was beloved and is. The Etna, largest colonial revival building ever built. It's a colonial style built in about 1930. And on the rooftop, they have a garden that was designed by a woman architect named Ellen Shipman. You can Google that name. She's pretty famous, but it's pretty nice. You go in, I mean, I've only been in once, but the president's office, they have these big glass doors and it opens out into a yard. And I always, on the roof of the building, and somebody gets paid to cut the grass up there. I mean, it's kind of amazing. And you can see in the lower right there, the little trees, you can see where it is, the trees on the lower right of the Etna building. Next week, I'm going to be back doing a program about Connecticut's capital. This was the biggest architectural achievement in the history of the city. The state paid most of the tab, but Hartford interests paid about a third of it. And it was an extraordinarily ambitious building that has so many layers of history and interest to it. I always loved giving, when I would take the Trinity College alumni group around on their Hartford, because Trinity's campus was originally on the location of the Capitol. So it has meaning to Trinity, but it's also just really thrilling to look at the Capitol from inside and out. City Hall is quite interesting. And so, you know, again, it's worth looking closely at some of these things. The G. Fox building, where Capital Community College is now located, is an Art Deco kind of masterpiece. And those, again, I'm getting old, but those of us in the room who remember G. Fox remember it fondly. It was an amazing experience to go there. Then you've got the whole Colt heritage dimension. The Colt Armory building was actually a replacement of the original building from the 1850s that burned during the Civil War. And then Elizabeth Colt, we'll hear more about her, paid to have it replicated. It's almost a twin, but with some more fireproof features of what Sam Colt himself had built. And the Onion Dome, of course, is the iconic architectural element that everybody driving by Hartford, if they recognize nothing else and they don't stop, Everybody remembers that dome. When Elizabeth Colt, Sam Colt's widow, passed away in 1905, she left land for Colt Park. She left the mansion house that they had lived in as a retirement home for women, and it's shown there on the lower left. And that, is an extraordinary building. It's not open to the public, though they do, or before COVID, they have allowed tour groups to go through there, and it's a national treasure. And then the Church of the Good Shepherd, which Elizabeth Colt commissioned, has the most amazing stained glass. And no, it's not by Tiffany. It's almost better. I just love it. And when the Church of the Good Shepherd was completed and opened in 1868, 69, it was described in national magazines as the finest example of ecclesiastical, church architecture in America when it was new. And it really kicked off the Gilded Age architectural rebuild of Hartford during the 70s and 80s. Trinity College was part of that. Other things were. And then the Colt Memorial House. Sam and Elizabeth Colt had one heir that lived to adulthood. They had several children that died in infancy, but young Caldwell lived longer, but he did not outlive his mother. And when he died in 1894, Elizabeth Colt commissioned this incredible national treasure. I call it this kind of almost eccentric masterpiece of Victorian design by the architect of the Mark Twain House. But it was before the Mark Twain House was built, and it's very biographical about Caldwell Colt, and it's one of the earliest buildings in the United States. Architects call this contextual design, where you design something that is meant to blend with something that already exists. So the church and the parish house kind of look alike in a way, similar, but the parish house, the memorial house, was built almost 30 years later. So pretty cool. And then even the worker housing in Coltsville, there are all these units that are still standing. The Potsdam Village units on the upper left and lower left shows a contemporary photograph. Sam Colt had them built in 1858 and 9, and he called them his little Swiss cottages. And a lot of the workers at Colt were German immigrants, and that's a whole story in itself. I already mentioned the Capewell Manufacturing Company and the Dutch colonial architecture. I still don't get it. It's amazing to me the number of buildings that have been rehabbed into condos in the past 15 years. The Capewell building sat there sucking wind for about 20 years. I don't know how long it was, but it was at least. And really, I just thought it's never going to be rehabbed. Well, it has been, and it's a really desirable place to live, and the office building is great, and there it is. And then, the stained glass stuff just across the street from Capital Community College was originally known as Trinity Church. They now call it Christ Church Cathedral, and it was where Trinity College had their graduation ceremonies for decades. And it is just spellbinding. The Gothic architecture, the history, the references to local people, the stained glass. And I even got up in the tower, and I didn't ring the bell, but I saw the bell and took a picture of it. And it was made. Troy, New York was the bell capital of the world at one time, and it was brought in from Troy in the 1820s. And it's just, it's a great, great building. And then we have so many houses of worship in Hartford, and some of them, to be honest, are kind of in trouble because there aren't as many people living in Hartford as there were. And of those who live here, there aren't as many. Hartford in 1830, 40, 50, probably, I don't have the exact number, but I think 75% of the residents went to church every week. I mean, it was, in terms of the high levels of religiosity, never seen anything like it. And so there were a lot of churches and a lot of buildings. And this one breaks my heart. And Rebecca will remember this because this was on our Living History North Hartford Festival in 2004. And it's known as Sacred Heart Church. And former mayor Eddie Perez, this was the church he grew up in, and it was, in the late years, it was mostly a Hispanic congregation, but it was built for the German Catholic community that mostly lived in that part of Hartford. And it has been empty now for 4 or 5 years. I think the building is for sale, and I don't know what's going to happen to it, but I love it. The interior, look at this piece of stained glass. It's just great. And it's right behind the Keeney Clock Tower. And if you ever get a chance to do one of the Isham Terry House events where they open up the clock tower and Isham Terry, in the past, we've gotten into Sacred Heart Church, and it's great. Another church that's for sale, and St. Peter's Catholic Church on Main Street in Hartford. They had a school, a convent house, and this church built at the same time as Elizabeth Colt's Good Shepherd, and it's empty right now, and who knows what's going to happen to it. As I mentioned, on November 13th, we're going to do a tour of Spring Grove Cemetery, and right next to Spring Grove, you can see the picture on the left there, is AME Zion, an African-American church. We're not going to go inside there, though I have been inside. On the right across the street, is the Faith Congregational Church, and maybe next year we'll have Jeff tell us all about the whole thing, because it's really a great story, and he's doing all this, him and a group, fabulous research and learning more about it. The Reverend Pennington, shown here, we'll hear more about him, but James Pennington was, attended Yale. He was a college graduate, African American preacher, anti-slavery, just a whole story in itself. Could go on for an hour. I won't. Art Deco. Who doesn't love Art Deco? The Polish home is where it is because that's where the Polish community lived, and a lot of them went to worked at Colt's, and it's part of the multi-layered, multicultural story of this great city. And then this is almost across the street from the Isham Terry House, right near the Keeney Clock Towers, known as the Flatiron Building on High Street, near the Isham Terry House Museum. I love this building. I fantasized in my sleep about buying it because it was spent 20 years. In fact, it's not occupied now. And I thought, gosh, what a great, great building. And I had a whole plan. I was going to move or see if I could get them to move the Jerk Pit Jamaican, unbelievable. But I love the Jerk Pit, and I wanted to move them in there or open a branch. And then I got this whole donut thing I won't get into, but I figured right across the street from the public safety building, and I was going to call it Hartford's Finest Donuts, because the police are right there, and we know how much policemen like donuts. We don't know. I'm just joking, but hey, I might have gotten rich. Too late. Anyway, the upstairs could have made nice apartments, and if God is still watching, something good will happen to this great building. The Widows' Homes, right across the street from Old North Cemetery. That's a story in itself about all the women that were left with shattered lives after the Civil War. So many, 600,000 deaths. And a lot of people who came home were wounded and maybe couldn't work. I mean, the Civil War was so much more. When people complain about how bad things are, you don't want to have been there. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And this was the beginning of Hartford's beginning to create a kind of safety net. And the widows' homes were for the widows of the Civil War, built right during the war by private money and philanthropists. Then the Soldiers' Arch, probably the most photographed. I don't know if you call it a building. It's not really a monument, although it is. And that's a whole story. We'll get into that next week because it's relevant to the story of the building of the state capitol, which you can see in the background. I love that. A few years ago, Jeff Partridge brought his students in. It was so much fun. We went up there and had a whole group. You can get 25, 30 people up into the tower. You have to walk 96 steps and there's no elevator. But if you feel like you could do it, you can get 30, 40 people upstairs. And one of my little fantasies is that someday I'm going to hire a caterer and throw a great party up there. We'll invite y'all. I'll pay for everything. We'll have liquor and everything you're not supposed to have. I don't know. But, and if the jerk pit reopens, we'll get them to cater it for the love of, anyway. And then museums. Hartford certainly has an abundance of museums. We've got that. Wadsworth Atheneum there is not a city this size. There is not a city twice this size in America with a museum so abundant in its holdings. I mean, the Atheneum certainly is a national treasure, and frankly, it was a job that I got there in 1980 that brought me here, so blame them. And the Colt Memorial Building, Elizabeth Colt, it's the first municipal art museum commissioned by a woman in the United States, and she left money to build the Colt Wing, and to fill it with all these incredible treasures. Anyway, she's the greatest philanthropist in the history of this city. The Connecticut Historical Society will be turning 200 in a few years, and they have just incredible stuff. So, these are places you can do projects, you can do research, you can learn more. The State Library, I probably spent 200 days of my life in the archives and genealogy section of the State Library particularly in the old days when everything was, it wasn't all digitized. You had to go and look at the documents. And the museum is great. The archives and library are great. They've got the Colt collection, the governor's portraits, the history of Connecticut manufacturing, a lot of good stuff. And it's free. And it's right across the street from the Capitol. Of course, the old State House, Connecticut's old State House, is a national treasure with lots of moving parts, lots of cool things, lots of cool spaces. I love the gallery downstairs, sort of orientation to history of Connecticut. And then upstairs, you got to go to the top floor to see Joseph Stewart recreation of the 1790s museum that was in this building when the building was new. Of course, you got Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe, the Twin Peaks of American literature. And, this is stuff, if these things were in any town in America, and that's all they had, they'd be slobbering over them. They'd be so excited. So we've got great, great stuff. Now, I love the Butler McCook House. Rebecca and I also worked together at Landmarks at the time that the Butler McCook House, we did a big redevelopment of it. And one of the coolest things on earth is Frances McCook, who was sort of the donor. She lived to be 90-something, and she donated the house, she and her brother, to the Landmark Society in the 1970s. And at the age of about 90, they sat down with a tape recorder and got her talking about things like the blizzard of '88, about the Irish servants that worked. I mean, really, they touched on so many topics. And we digitized some of those tapes. And you walk into a room, you push a button, and she talks to you from 1970. This is the Butler McCook House, and it is awesome. The Isham Terry House, probably my favorite. It is another time capsule loaded with what I call Hartfordisms. And then the Chick Austin, these are all like museums, open to the public. Chick Austin House, designed for and by Atheneum's pioneering modernist director. It's on Scarborough Street. We've got diversity and inclusion, Amistad, North Hartford, Faith Congregational, Prudence Crandall's statue of her in the state capitol. And in Old North Cemetery is the largest concentration of Black Civil War veterans in the state. And I've taken groups there and people just like shake. They get so emotional looking at some of this history. So it's all, and then the Amistad ship every once in a while, the Freedom Schooner, as they call it, pulls into port. And, it's all good. The Amistad Center, I was proud of this. I was on the search committee that hired my dear late friend, Barbara Hudson. She was the first curator of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. And the Wadsworth Atheneum had one of the first art museums in America to have an African-American collection and an African-American curator and a program, really. And they've done dozens, maybe 75 or more exhibits over the years. Great, great content and an important facet of the Wadsworth Atheneum story. I hope I live long enough. I get confused about all this because it doesn't seem to happen quickly. I never met John E. Rogers, but that's a picture of him in the center below with my late friend who I did know, Bill Warren. He was the first curator director at the Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe houses. He was one of my mentors, and he worked at the Connecticut Historical Society for years. John E. Rogers was an African-American who collected Hartford Black history. And there is a collection that I've never seen, and the state of Connecticut put up some money to retrofit the building in the upper right to be a center for the John E. Rogers African American Cultural Center on Albany Avenue, which has not yet happened, and it's been a work in progress for a little too long. On the lower right there is another of my dear friends. Barbara Aline was a tremendous champion. She was involved with the Faith Congregational Church, and she just loved history, and that was our bond. And she loved the North End, and she liked African American history, and she did walking tours and things, and so we got a lot of room to go, and a lot more to learn, and many more stories to tell. Ditto, Italians, Irish, Germans, Poles, Hartford's rich stew of ethnicity, but public engagement doesn't happen by accident. We need to do the work to bring these stories to life, and frankly, nobody will be surprised if I say this. We need to put a stop to monument removals, whatever one thinks of Christopher Columbus, and we could debate that and should, but we shouldn't destroy monuments while we're thinking about it or actually avoiding thinking about it. City leaders, I don't need to name them, but there is or could be a book on each of these civic giants. I created a little picture of Mount Rushmore, and I put Hartford figures on it in the background. Because, leadership matters, and these are some incredible stuff and stories. Next year is the bicentennial of the birth of Hartford, born and raised and buried. He's up in Old North Cemetery. Frederick Law Olmsted, pictured on the left, is a giant. Every school in America should teach why. And some of them may get to it, but this is stuff that should be in high school curriculums. On the right is Frederick Church, the greatest artist of the 19th century. I call these two the twin peaks of the environmental movement. They were both born and buried in Hartford. Church is at Spring Grove. You come on the tour on November 13th, you get to see his final resting place. But these two, I get emotional talking about it. The height of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln commissions Olmsted, write me a report that will explain why we should save Yosemite. And that report became the germ, the seed that gave birth to the National Park Service. Frederick Law Olmsted was a giant. Some lesser known giants, Reverend Joel Hawes at First Church, Center Church in Hartford, wrote a book that was an international bestseller called Lectures to Young Men on the Formation of Character. And this was one of the books that young Sam Colt at the age of 15 or 16 was a parishioner in his church. And, they've got apparently his library is intact, all the books. I was going to do a program for this series this year, but because of COVID, I couldn't get access, about how, why Hartford became the center of the religious book publishing industry in America in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and why anyone in 2021 could possibly care less. I'm sure there's a compelling answer, but I couldn't get access to the sources. So maybe next year, if we all survive, we'll be back and do that. Reverend Horace Bushnell, you've heard of Bushnell Park and the Bushnell Theater. These are all stories every school child should learn. Daniel Wadsworth is book-worthy. He brokered the relationship between Thomas Cole, the great figure, founder of the Hudson River School of Art, and that led to one of the 2 or 3 most important American art movements, which was this Hudson River School. And that's lower right is Thomas Cole, in the center was his apprentice, his student, the only one he ever took on. Frederick Church, and you know, great stuff. Daniel Wadsworth made that happen. Lydia Sigourney, long before there was Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was the first American woman to make a substantial living as a writer. President James Buchanan visits Hartford in 1859 and 58, I forget the year. He was president of the United States, and he wants to meet the great lady, Lydia Sigourney, and he has his carriage pull up to her house because, you know, it doesn't matter if you're president. She doesn't come to you, you go to her. And she's a great story, and her writings should be read. I've read some of it, not all of it, but maybe one year, maybe one of you will develop a program on Lydia, and we'll pay you to deliver it. You'll be very happy. Maybe not. But in any event, James Patterson, another one of my heroes, founder of Travelers, but most interesting to me is a monument maker and sculptor, an entrepreneur of epic accomplishments. And his sculpture studio was almost on the location of the Keeney Clock Tower. So there's not only what you see up there, but what we've lost. And all of that's, in a sense, recoverable. Elizabeth Colt, a visionary, civic peacemaker, and greatest philanthropist in the history of the city. She left a museum. She left a park. She left a retirement home for women. She founded a social service agency when there were none. And one of the greatest benefactors of the Episcopal Church. She built the Church of the Good Shepherd without asking for a state grant or anything else. She just did it. And God bless, she's so cool. The Goodwin family, where they built parks, museums, and influenced religion. Major James Goodwin was known as the insurance king of Hartford. When their mansion on Woodland Street across from what is now St. Francis was demolished in the 1940s, they pulled the best room in the house out and installed it at the Wadsworth Athenaeum where it is today. And their story also is worth remembering. Henry Wood Irving, shown here, helped make Hartford a pioneering center of antiques, collecting, display, and preservation. His house still stands on Prospect. He was a banker, but he was also one of the very first antique collectors in America. Emily Holcomb, another one of my heroes, the most effective preservationist Hartford ever had, saved and restored the ancient burying ground, stood up to the wrecking ball to save this building, the old State House, helped develop the museum house in Windsor that belonged to founding father and member of the first United States Senate, Oliver Ellsworth. She's the reason it says Constitution State on our license plates, and she did major things at the World's Fairs. I have a whole thing on her. I won't go further. Reverend James Pennington, anti-slavery crusader, African-American trailblazer, come to our tour again at Faith on November 13th. I'm so excited about it. And, you know, he wrote a textbook of the origin and history of the colored people in 1841. And my friend Fiona Vernal, who's speaking in 2 more weeks, is here. She probably knows more about this than I do, but is that possibly, Fiona, one of the first historical accounts? It may not be fully accurate, but yeah. So pretty cool stuff. And we got our little national park. My goal is to live long enough to see them open the visitor center. They're getting there. And you cannot overstate the importance. If Hartford doubling tourism visitation to the city is something you could do in your sleep almost, but it does require caring and trying. And we have had issues with making that happen, but it will happen. And having a national park situated here is going to add 100,000 visitors a year to this city. And it's jobs, it's opportunities, it's national prestige. Everything about it is to love. And I'm so glad this is an evolving, positive thing. Industrialization, manufacturing, well, it's kind of in the rearview mirror, but boy, Hartford made so many amazing things. And if I again had a magic wand, the Museum of Connecticut History does stuff with it, but we should have so much. You shouldn't have to go to the Smithsonian in Washington to learn about Hartford's industrial history, but there is no place in Hartford that does the job better than the Smithsonian presently does. And it's very cool stuff. We made hardware, we made tools, we made sewing machines, we made typewriters, we made automobiles, we made automobile tires, and we developed automobile insurance, hardly a surprise. And all of that is, oh, well, I don't know what is not, I don't know why there's a blank there. What is not to love? People protect what they love, but can only love people and places and things they actually know about. So teaching local, learn local is, kind of my mantra. And next week, I'm going to be doubling back with the Capitol, which is incredible. And it's just some stuff my late friend Bill Foddy was the director. He saved this place, the old State House. He was one of the great talents I ever knew. And he is the only person I ever knew who had 4 major campaigns of preservation, everyone successful. He brought the Mark Twain House to prominence and online. He came into the old State House when it was at risk and preserved that. And then his last act was this incredible work of generosity and vision involving the city archives, which, if I have this straight, are now mostly at the museum, at the Hartford History Center at the city library, but were an absolute mess and chaotic. And Bill Foddy spent several of the last years of his life getting those in order and arranging for their proper transferal. Over the years, I've done walking tours, bus tours, cycling tours. I love this stuff. I love what we're doing right now is talking about this place and learning to love it. I don't know if I'm getting a little older. I don't know if I could still do this, but this was what I called the Tour de Hartford, this 13-mile loop where we got on bicycles, went all around, looked at stuff. And that's me with a helmet. Somebody got mad because there was picture me in the newspaper before the tour without a helmet. And I said, why aren't you wearing a helmet? I don't know, because I never did, but I guess if I have to, I will. So anyway, I wore the helmet on the day, and we had a really good time, and there's just so much of that stuff. Again, Jeff Partridge has done extraordinary work studying the theory practice of place-based, what I increasingly prefer to call place-conscious education, the consciousness. You cannot know something until you know it. And I say we're all put on this earth completely ignorant. We know nothing. And then we learn things. And then we learn more things. And that sense of, how did Whitney Houston put it? The greatest love of all. I mean, it's got to start somewhere, and it should start local. Anyway, and again, I've had many opportunities to give walking tours to students. The lower right there is up in the dome of the Colt Armory building. I had a tour group up there. The lower upper left is a group from Trinity at Old North Cemetery, and then another tour group at the Museum of Connecticut History on the lower right. And yes, tourism is not a bad word. Historic Hartford, which you can take the little Facebook thing if you're not on Facebook with it. I post stuff all the time. It's a labor of love, entirely voluntary, but it is what I do in my retirement is try to keep connecting to folks. Tourism is not a bad word. Historic Hartford, which is really not an institution. We don't have tax exempt status. We don't ask for money. We don't get grants. But it was founded in 1993 with the mission to double visitation to the city, which I still believe, is not a stretch goal. But it won't happen by accident. I could write a book on why it matters and why it hasn't happened yet. And if you go on my YouTube channel, my name is William Hosley, or just search Hosley Tourism, you'll get the YouTube video that talks all about the tourism opportunity. I've written op-eds. I've done everything but promise to leave town. That might work. I'm kidding. Maybe I'm not. Scholarship matters. The astonishing array of libraries and archives in the cities includes 2 of the finest statewide historical libraries in the country, the archives of the United Church of Christ, the Watkinson Library at Trinity College, the Auerbach Library at Wadsworth Atheneum, and Hartford Public Library's Hartford History Center. With so much online, including the searchable historic Hartford Current, local history research has never been easier. These are some of my kindred spirits. I'm trying to think if anybody's in the room. Well, there's Bill Foddy again. A lot of these people are gone. The upper second from right, Catherine Day. She so deserves a whole hour-long feature. This woman saved Mark Twain's house, saved the Harriet Beecher Stowe house, left it a gigantic endowment, and stood up to death threats in the 1930s for trying to save Nook Farm. And because the usual forces of evil, the only good building is a building we demolish so we can build a new one. The construction industrial complex never sleeps. And she is a Hartford hero. She deserves, when they talk about statues on the state capitol, there are a lot of opportunities. We don't have to take anything out. We can put some new ones in if you want. She'd be maybe my first candidate. Ann Kukrow in the upper right did so much to save Wethersfield. Tom Condon, lower right, fabulous journalist friend with the Hartford Current for many years. There's Emily Holcomb on the upper left. And then Jared Edwards, who was, I call him the boy genius. He was the president of the board of the Mark Twain House at the age of 29. And he's now closer to 80. And he has been climbing through barbed wire for preservation all these years since. Well, I'm almost done. Our country may literally depend on what we're talking about. Civics, education, history. Where are we going to get it from? The cohesion, the unity that has been missing for some time. Not pretty. Patriotism, national pride, it starts with knowing and appreciate what's in your own backyard. So on that cheerful note, I think I'm almost done. And do we have questions, comments, live or online? Yeah. Hartford. Oh, she's asking, where would you put the national park in Hartford? That's what Coltsville is. It's already a national park. It just, when people think of the national parks, they think of Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. But there are many, many national parks that are historic sites. And there's 18 of them in Massachusetts alone. And so Coltsville is going to be the flagship of the National Park Service in Hartford. They're already doing a very good job, but ultimately they know where they want to do it. They're going to get the money to do it eventually. These things take time. They're going to have a visitor center down near the Colt Armory, which will be the jumping off point for the Coltsville experience, which should be the jumping off point for the Hartford experience. And we, look, New York City, it's ridiculous to compare us. Before the pandemic, New York City claimed to have 55 million visitors a year, tourist visitors a year. It is a gigantic economy. Nations like France and Italy, that's their biggest industry. And people sometimes laugh at me. They say, well, nobody's going to come to Hartford. How about let's try harder and see if that doesn't work? You can't disprove a theory that hasn't been tried. I'm a believer. Yeah.
You mentioned Frederick Olmsted.
Yeah.
And one other natural.
Frederick Church?
Yeah, was it Frederick Church?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, is that? So you just wanted to write it down? Yeah. Well, they're cool, and they, to me, it gives me goosebumps. You could throw, if you had a good arm, you could throw a snowball from Olmsted's. Not a snowball. You could throw a hardball from Olmsted's burying site to Frederick Church's. They knew each other. They were contemporaries, and no two people did more to kickstart the environmental movement in America. And they're both from Hartford, shaped by Hartford, buried in Hartford. Yes, in the back.
Hi, Bill. We have a question from Daniel, who's watching on the Old State House Facebook page. And Daniel asks, are there people from the 20th century that you think should be celebrated?
Well, that's a really good question. I live in the past. No, I'm working on it. I thought Thurman Milner was pretty cool. Certainly some of the insurance titans, but help me, yeah. Maria Sanchez, look, when Jeff says he knows all this stuff about history, I don't know 1/100th of what can be known. And one of the things I'm proud of this series, we're breaking into new areas, and Fiona Vernal, professor at UConn, does a lot of work with Hartford, spoke last year. She's back this year with another topic. And, the rising generation, it's you guys, it's people a little younger than me who are going to take this ball to the next, take this to the next level and bring new stuff into it.
Was the question 19th century?
No, 20th.
So would Ellsworth Grant qualify?
Maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, there are people, and again, Ellsworth Grant wrote history, but he sort of made history, but I think Bill Foddy was more important.
So every good tourist town has places to stay.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Hartford has no bed and breakfasts that I'm aware of. And you're very knowledgeable about architecture. Wave your magic wand and tell me where you would put the bed and breakfasts for your tourist industry.
Well, Buckingham Street. I mean, look, we don't know what this city will be in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years. My wife talked me off the ledge. A few years ago, one of those worker houses in Coltsville was for sale for $55,000, which is, it's a lot of money, but it's not that much money for a real house. And I thought, God, this is an 1850 historic building. Wouldn't that be pretty cool if you could stay in a building that Sam Colt had designed and commissioned? Tourism and the hospitality piece, where you stay, restaurants, those things kind of ramp up in tandem. And, Hartford is not entirely visitor ready, but there's plenty to do here. And we go to a lot. I mean, we're a couple of years ago, my wife and I, before the pandemic, I joke about it, and I hope this won't offend anybody. We may be the first people who ever flew deliberately to Indianapolis with no connections, no business, no other reason to be there than curiosity. I wanted to see what Indiana was like. You know what? There's amazing stuff. Indianapolis is very cool. And we got to get in the game. I mean, I taught a course on placemaking and heritage tourism at Boston for a number of years. And I happened to spend weeks at a time in Boston in August during the height of the tourism season. And at the height of the tourism season, Boston does 75,000 visitors a day. Hartford right now is maybe doing 150,000 tourist visits per year. I think we can improve on that. Yeah.
Well, I will agree with you on Indiana because my daughter went to Indiana University, and you might be interested to know that the World's Fair, St. Louis World's Fair, they had the Connecticut State Building, which was modeled after Lydia Sigourney's house.
Yes.
And when it finished, it was a big success, and a gentleman from Lafayette, Indiana, bought the building and moved it to Lafayette, Indiana. You can see it today. It's a museum, art museum of Indiana history.
And guess who's been there?
You have.
Yeah,
there you go.
And I had to go because it was Shep Holcomb's grandmother that commissioned that building. And it reeked of Hartford. And it was so amazing because his own family did not know the building existed. And I didn't even remember how I stumbled on it. But West Lafayette, Indiana, is the home of Purdue University. And then it's home of this Indiana museum that it was the Connecticut Pavilion that you're referring to. And there's also a really great Frank Lloyd Wright house there. So, you know, every place has treasures. Yeah.
Partridge here. I don't think it's out of place that we're talking about Indianapolis and other places, because one of the things that I've discovered about getting really interested in Hartford and learning about Hartford and digging in deep and learning to appreciate it is when you visit other places or maybe move to other places. I'm not from here either. You start to look for those things and you start to appreciate the history and the people who came before, the sort of people who have kind of made history for us and blazed the path for us. So I think place-based learning is not just about the place where you are, but it's getting to know what it means to have a sense of place.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Fiona, hey.
So, what other cities that are similar to Hartford demographically, or maybe has a similar past, are doing it well? Are doing this kind of, we're doing tourism well. Like, we're not going to be New York, we're
Yeah.
not Boston. So what's a more
Really
appropriate model?
Great question. And, you know, because I grew up in Rochester, New York, which is so similar to Hartford. It's almost amazing. In that it was an industrial superpower that lost some of its industries. It's, you know, it's got issues, but also an abundance of things. And so I'm going to really pass almost on that, because I have a personal special affection for what I call second tier cities. This is not a winner takes all sweepstakes. Boston and New York and San Francisco and New Orleans, and those are great places. I mean, I think Atlanta is much bigger, much richer, but Atlanta, it has become so compelling, and they really work at it. Now, it's not a fair comparison, again, because it's much bigger than Hartford. But I'm gonna scratch my head a little bit on that, and maybe next week I'll have a better answer. But great question. We can look over our shoulders at what other communities do and learn things. There's cookies and all kinds of goodies, I think, in the next room. And if you don't eat them up, Rebecca's going to have to take them all home. And she doesn't want to do that. Well, she might want an extra cookie, but we don't know. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah.